From external influence to the internal dynamics of the conflict itself, are there any hopes for the upcoming peace talks? And what is the overall co-editor of the book Arab Spring Dreams, and he is also a Middle East analyst. Let's start there with Assad's government. Given Russia's role, would Assad's government actually be going to the table if not?
Thanks, Mike, for having me. The Assad regime really is a recipient of an international umbrella here. The only reason that it's going and attending the Geneva process is because it is convinced that the rules of the game there have been set in its favor. Because if you read and look at the details what have been discussed, the rebels, the opposition, demands are entirely set aside. None of them is being met, and they are chiefly to stop bombardment on civilian locations, to lift the siege from over 380,000 Syrians, if not more, who are under siege by government forces, and to accept an exit of Bashar al-Assad from the presidency. None of these conditions is being met, and the real reason behind that, the United States, Russia, and the European Union seem to have come to a conclusion that the war in Syria needs to be ended no matter what the cost is. And that's ultimately implicitly accepting that Bashar al-Assad will remain at the helms of Syria. So Assad is attending only because he knows that the deck of cards is staked in his favor and that he's not forced under any pressure to make any significant concessions.
We heard in Nathan's report talking about the Nusra Front and ISIL. Talk to us about the opposition groups. Who's left out there?
What is left of the opposition group, interestingly, is that generally the reporting on the opposition is heavily skewed because the estimates have the total size of the rebellion to be around 130,000 people under arms, of which the Nusra, by the most generous estimate, are at between 16 and 18,000 fighters. The reason that they get a lot of airtime is that because they're effective in battle and because of their affiliation to Al-Qaeda. So overall, they are not even 11% of the entire size of the rebellion, which is really why many Syria watchers have been raising the question about the over-focus on Al-Qaeda, which is really more of an outsider's fixation on the Al-Qaeda problem, looking at the small problem and overlooking the larger problem, which is Syria, a nation of 25 million, turning into a vortex that is throwing terrorism, refugees, and misery to regions way beyond its borders.
Well, what should be focused on? I mean, what is the international press missing?
The international press missing, what is the international press missing is the larger problem. Syria, again, is a nation of 25 million, which is made up of about 74% Sunnis who've been ruled for the last 50 years by a minority of 10%. What is being missing is that this formula doesn't work, and that has been expressed since 2011 peacefully and then violently. What people seem to be resistant to admit is that when the United States went to Iraq and changed an abnormal state of affairs, which is a country dominated by minority, and allowed the majority of Iraqis to govern the country, that very same principle is being denied today to the Syrians. That's the heart of the problem. The issue of Nusra and ISIS, for all the gore and the graphic imagery that comes from their terrorism, frankly, is a side issue. Because as long as Bashar al-Assad remains in control in Syria, that will only provide more breeding ground for terrorism. So stop focusing on the symptoms and deal with the root cause infection.
Okay, so you talked about Assad, but you also mentioned that the deck seems to be stacked in his favor. The calls for Assad to resign seem to have fizzled. What's been happening there, do you think?
The calls basically have fizzled because the main international player that has been perceived to be issuing that call, chiefly the United States, have had a change of heart. The United States actually never really meant what it said about Assad's departure, and its policy of late, cumulative effects of its policy over the last 4 years has been to give Bashar al-Assad a pass and only verbal warnings. When the time came to act, the Obama administration didn't act, and it is under constant pressure because it needs to show results in order to maintain the security architecture of its alliances in the Middle East and beyond. It seems to have reached the conclusion that it should do whatever it can to completely liquidate the armed resistance to Assad, specifically because of the pressure on its European allies through the refugees question, and also because the Obama administration has resisted from the beginning of the war in Syria to get involved in it militarily. So it is looking for a cheap exit, allowing Russia to do basically the necessary work of bombing the rebellion, while maintaining the appearances of having somewhat of a sympathetic view of the Syrian rebellion. So in short, all of this is basically international kabuki.
Nasser, I've got time for one more question. You were co-editor of the book Arab Spring Dreams. We look at Egypt, we look at Libya, we look at Syria, we look at Tunisia, we look at the Arab Spring in total. What's the verdict on it?
The verdict is still out. The jury, we're dealing with problems that have been accumulated over a century. Any reasonable observer cannot expect a century's worth of problems to be resolved in 5 years. The jury is still out, and we're way too early to issue a verdict.
All right, Nasser Weddady joining us from Boston. Thanks so much.